Chapter 40. When Stanley found the onion the night before, he didn't question how it had come to be there. He ate it gratefully, but now he sat gazing at Big Thumb and the meadows full of flowers. He couldn't help but wonder about it. If there was one wild onion, there could be more. He intertwined fingers and tried to rub the pain. When he bent down and dug another flower, this time pulling out the entire fat, including the roots. Onions! Sweet, fresh onions! Sam called as Mary Lou pulled the cart down the main street. 8 cents a dozen! It was a beautiful spring morning. The sky was painted pale blue and pink, the same color as the lake and the peaches trees along its shore. Miss Gladys Tennyson was wearing her nightgown and robe as she came running down the street after Sam. Mr. Tennyson was a very proper woman who never went out in public without dressing up in fine clothes and a hat. So it was surprising to the people of Green Lake to see her running past them. "Sam!" she shouted. "Whoa, Mary Lou," said Sam, stopping his mule and cart. "Good morning, Miss Tennyson," he said. "How's Becca doing?" Gladys Tennyson was all smiles. "I think she's going to be all right. The fever broke about an hour ago. Thanks to you. I'm sure the good Lord and Doc Hawthorne deserve most of the credit." "The good Lord, yes. But not Dr. Hawthorne. That quack wanted to put leeches on her stomach. Leeches, my word. He said they would suck up the bad blood. Now you tell me, how would a leech know good blood from bad blood? I wouldn't know," said Sam. "It was your onion tonic," said Mrs. Tennyson. "That's what saved her." Other townspeople made their way to the cart. "Good morning, ladies," said Miss Hattie Parker. "Don't you look lovely this morning?" Several people snickered. "Good morning, Haidee," Mr. Tennyson replied. "Does your husband know that you were parading about in your bed clothes?" Hattie asked. There were more sniggers. "My husband knows exactly where I am and how I'm dressed, thank you," said Mr. Tennyson. "We both have been dressed up all night and half the morning with Rebecca. She almost died from stomach sickness. It seems she ate bad meat." Hattie's face flushed. Her husband, Jim Parker, was a butcher. "It made my husband and me sick as well," said Mr. Tennyson. "It nearly killed Becca. With her being so young, Sam saved her life." "It wasn't me," said Sam. "It was the onions." "I'm glad Becca's all right," Haidee said kindly. "I'm telling Jim he needs to wash his knives," said Mr. Pike, who owned a general store. Haidee Parker excused herself, then turned quickly away. "Tell Becca when she feels up to it to come by a store for a piece of candy." "Thank you, I'll do that." Before returning home, Mr. Tennyson brought a dozen onions from Sam. She gave him a dime and told him to keep the change. "I don't take charity," she told her, "but if you want a few extra onions for Mary Lou, I'm sure she'll accept it." "All right, then," said Mr. Tennyson. "Give me my change in onions." Sam gave Mr. Tennyson an additional 3 onions, then fed one at a time to Mary Lou. She laughed as the old donkey ate them out of her hand. Stanley and Zero slept off for the next 2 days, ate onions, all they wanted, and splashed dirty water into their mouths. The late afternoon, Big Thumb gave them shade. Stanley made to try to make the hole deeper, but he really needed the shovels. His effort just seemed to stir up the mud and make the water dirtier. Zero was sleeping. He was still very sick and weak. But the Stanley was no longer afraid that he would die soon. Still, didn't want him to wake up and think he'd been deserted. He waited for Zero to open his eyes. "I think I'll go look for the shovel. I'll wait here," Zero said feebly. And if he had any further choice, Stanley headed down the mountain. The sleep and the onions had done him a lot good as well. He felt strong. It was fairly easy to follow the trail he had made 2 days earlier. There were a few places he wasn't sure going the right way, so it took a bit of searching before he found the trail again. He went quite a way down the mountain, but still didn't find the shovel. He looked back up towards the top of the mountain. He must have walked straight past it, he thought. There was no way he could have carried Zero all the way from here. Still, he headed downwards just in case. He came bare spot where 2 large patches of weed had sat down to rest. Now he definitely had gone too far. He decided he was tired of walking down the hill. It should have been impossible to have carried Zero up the hill from here, especially after walking all day with no food or water. The shovel must be buried in some weeds. Before starting back up, he took one last look in all directions. He saw huge indentations in the weed just a little farther down the mountain. It didn't seem likely that the shovel could be there. Already come this far. There, lying in some tall weeds, he found the shovel and the sack of jars. He was amazed. He wondered if the shovel and the sack might have rolled down the hill, but none of the jars were broken except the one which had broken earlier. And if they rolled down the hill, it's doubtful that the sack and the shovel side by side. On his way up the mountain, Stanley had to sit and rest several times. It was a long, hard climb. Chapter 41. Zero's condition continued to improve. Stanley slowly peeled an onion. He liked eating them one layer at a time. The water hole was now as large as the holes he had dug back at Camp Green Lake. It contained almost 2 feet of murky water. Stanley had dug it all himself. Zero had feared to help, but Stanley thought it would be better for Zero to save his strength. It was a lot harder to dig in the water than it was in a dry lake. Stanley was surprised that he himself hadn't gotten sick, either from the spillage or the dirty water, or from living on onions. He used to get sick quite a lot back at home. The boys were barefoot. They had washed their socks. All their clothes were very dirty, but their socks were definitely the worst. They didn't dip their socks into the hole, afraid to contaminate from the water. Instead, they filled the jars and poured water over their dirty socks. I didn't go to the homeless shelter very often, Zero said. Just if the weather was really bad, I'd have to find someone to pretend to be my mom. If I had just gone by myself, they would have asked me a bunch of questions. If they found out I didn't have a mom, they would make me a ward of the state. What's the ward of the state? Zero smiled. I don't know, but I didn't like the sound of it. Zero remembered Mr. Pendeski telling the warden that Zero was a ward of the state. He wondered if Zero knew he'd become one. I like sleeping outside, said Zero. I used to pretend I was a Cub Scout. I always wanted to be a Cub Scout. I see them at the park in their blue uniforms. I was never a Club Scout, said Stanley. I wasn't good at social stuff like that. Kids made fun of me because I was fat. I liked the blue uniforms. Maybe wouldn't like being a Club Scout. Stanley shrugged one shoulder. My mother was once a Girl Scout, said Zero. I thought you didn't have a mother. Everybody has to have a mother. Well, yeah, I know that. She said she once won a prize for selling the most Girl Scout cookies. She was really proud of that. Stanley peeled off another layer of his onion. We always took what we needed, Zero said. When I was little, I didn't even know if it was stealing. I don't remember when I found out, but we just took what we needed, never more. So when I saw the shoes on display on the shelter, I reached into the glass case and took them. Charles Linguiston's shoes. I didn't know they were his. I thought they were just somebody's old shoes. It was better to take someone's old shoes, I thought, than steal a pair of new ones. I didn't know they were famous. There was a sign, but of course I couldn't read it. And then the next thing I know, everybody's making this big deal, how the shoes are missing. It was kind of wearing the shoes, everyone running around saying, I just walked out the door. No one noticed me. When I got outside, I ran in the corner and immediately took off the shoes. I put them on the top of a parked car. I remember they smelled really bad. Yeah, those were them, said Stanley. Did they fit you? Pretty much. Stanley remembered being surprised at Charles Linguiston's shoes. Small shoe size. Stanley's shoes were bigger. Charles Linguiston had small, quick feet. Stanley were big and slow. I should have just kept them, said Zero. I already made it out of the shelter and everything. I ended up getting arrested the next day when I walked out of the shoe store with a new pair of sneakers. If I just have kept those old smelly sneakers, then neither of us would be here right now. Zero came strong enough to help dig the hole. When he finished, it was over 6 feet deep. He filled the bottom with rocks to separate the water from the dirt. He was still the best hole digger around. That's the last hole I'll ever dig, he declared, throwing down the shovels. Stanley smiled. He wished it was true, but he knew they had no choice but to eventually return to Camp Green Lake. They couldn't live on onions forever. Teeny had been completely around Big Thumb. It was like a giant sundial. It followed the shade. They were able to see out in all directions. There was no place to go. The mountain was surrounded by a desert. Zero stared at the Big Thumb. It must have had a hole in it, he said, filled with water. You think? Where else would the water be coming from? Zero asked. Water doesn't run uphill. Stanley bit into the onion. It didn't burn his eyes or nose, and in fact he noticed a particularly strong taste. He remembered that once he first carried Zero up the hill, how the air had smelled bitter. It was the smell of thousands of onions growing and rotting and sprouting. Now he didn't smell a thing. How many onions do you think we've eaten? He asked. Zero shrugged. I don't know how long being here. I say about a week, said Stanley, and we probably eat about 20 onions a day, so that's 280 onions, said Zero. Stanley smiled. I bet we really stink. 2 nights later, Stanley lay awake up at the star-filled sky. He was too happy to fall asleep. He knew he had no reason to be happy. He had heard or read somewhere that a right person before a person leads to death. He suddenly feels nice and warm. He wondered if perhaps he was experiencing something like that. It occurred to him that he couldn't remember the last time he felt happiness. It wasn't just being sent to Camp Green Lake that had made his life miserable, but that he'd been unhappy at school where he had no friends and bullies like Derek Dune had picked on him. No one liked him, and the truth was, he didn't especially like himself. He liked himself now. He wondered if he was delicious. He looked over at Zero sleeping near him. Zero's face was lit in the starlight. There was no flower petals in front of his nose that moved back and forth as he breathed. It reminded Stanley of something out of a cartoon. Zero breathed in and the petals were drawn, almost touching his nose. Then Zero breathed out. The petal moved towards his chin. It stayed on Zero's face for an amazing long time before fluttering off the side. Stanley considered placing it back in front of Zero's nose. But it wouldn't be the same. It seemed Zero had lived at Camp Green Lake forever. But as Stanley had thought about it now, he realized that Zero must have gotten there no more than a month or 2 days before him. Zero was actually arrested a day later, but Stanley's trial kept getting delayed because of baseball. He remembered what Zero said about a few days before. If Zero had just kept those shoes, then neither of them would be here right now. As Stanley stared at the glittering night sky, he thought there was no place he would rather be. He was glad that Zero put the shoes on the parked car. He was glad they fell from the overpass and hit him on the head. The shoes first fell from the sky, he remembered, thinking that destiny had struck him. Now he thought again, it was more than a coincidence. It has to be destiny. Maybe they wouldn't have to return to Camp Green Lake, he thought. Maybe they could make it past the camp, then follow the dirt roads back to civilization. They could fill the sack with onions and 3 jars with water. And he had his canteen as well. Could refill their jars and canteen at the camp, maybe sneak into the kitchen and get some food. He doubted any counselor was still on guard. Everyone had to think they were dead. Berserk food. It would mean living the rest of his life as a fugitive. The police would have always be after him. At least he could call his parents and tell him he was still alive, but he couldn't go visit them in case the police was watching the apartment. Although if everyone thought he was dead, they wouldn't bother to watch the apartment. He would have to somehow get a new identity. I'm now really thinking crazy, he thought. He wondered if a crazy person wonders if he's crazy. But even as he thought this, an even crazier idea kept popping into his head. He knew it was too crazy for even to consider. Still, if it was going to be a fugitive for the rest of his life, it would help to have some money, perhaps a treasure chest full of money. You're crazy, he told himself. Besides, just because he found a lipstick container with KB in it doesn't mean there was a treasure buried there. It was crazy. It was all part of his crazy feeling of happiness. Or maybe it was his destiny. He reached over and shook Zero's arm. Hey, Zero, he whispered. Huh? Zero muttered. Zero, wake up. What? Zero raised up his head. What is it? Do you want to dig one more hole? Zero asked him. We weren't always homeless, Zero said. I remember a yellow room. How old were you when you... Stanley started to ask, but he couldn't find the right words. Moved out. I don't know. I must have been really little, because I don't remember too much. I don't really remember moving out. I remember standing in a crib with my mother singing to me. She held my wrist and made my hands clap together. She used to sing that song to me. That one you sang. It was different, though. Joe spoke slowly, and if searching his brain for memories and clues. And then later, I know we lived on the street, but I don't know why we left the house. I was pretty sure it was a house and not an apartment. I know my room was yellow. That later afternoon, they were resting in the shadows of the Chapter 43. Dad spent the morning picking onions and putting them into the sack. They didn't take long, but long enough so they had to wait another day before heading down the mountain. They wanted to leave the first hint of daylight, so they had plenty of time to make it to Camp Green Lake before dark. Stanley wanted to be sure he could find the right hole. Then they would hide by it until everyone went to sleep. They would dig for as long as it seemed safe and not a second longer. And then, treasure or no treasure, they They head up the dirt road. It was absolutely safe. Then they try to steal some food and water from the camp kitchen. I'm good at sneaking in and out of places, Zero had said. Remember, Stanley had warned him, the drawers to the rec room squeaks. Now he lay on his back, trying to save his strength for the days long ahead. He wondered what would happen to Zero's parents. But he didn't ask. Zero didn't like answering questions. It was better to just let him talk when he felt like it. Zero thought about his own parents. Stanley thought about his own parents. In her last letter, his mom was worried that they might evicted from their apartment because the smell of their burning sneakers. They could easily become homeless as well. Again, he wondered if they'd been told that he ran away from camp. Were they told he was dead? An image appeared in his head, parents hugging each other and crying. He tried not to think about it. Instead, he tried to capture the feelings he had the night before, an inexplicable feeling of happiness, the sense of destiny, but those feelings didn't return. He just felt scared. The next morning, they headed down the mountain. They drunken their caps into the water hole before putting them on their heads. Zero held the shovel and Stanley carried the sack, which was crammed with onions and the 3 jars of water. They left the pieces of broken jars on the mountain. This is where I found the shovel, Stanley said, pointing on the patch of reed. Zero turned and looked up towards the top of the mountain. That's a long way. You were light, Stanley said. You already thrown up everything that was inside your stomach. He shifted the sack from one shoulder to the other. It was heavy. He stepped on the loose rock, slipped, and fell hard. The next thing he knew, he was sliding down the steep slide of the mountain. He dropped the sack and the onions spilled around him. He slid into the patch of weeds and grabbed into a thorny vine. The vine ripped out of the earth, but slowed him enough he was able to stop himself. Are you all right? Zero asked from above. Stanley groaned as he pulled a thorn out of the palm of his hand. Yeah, he said. He was all right. He was worried of the jars of water. Zero climbed down after him, retrieving the sack along the way. Stanley pulled some thorns out of his pants and legs. The jar hadn't broken. The onions had protected them. Like styrofoam packing material. Glad you didn't do that when you were carrying me, Zero said. They lost about a third of the onions, but recovered many of them as they continued down the mountain. When they reached the bottom, the sun was rising above the lake. They walked directly towards it. Soon, they stood on the edge of a cliff, looking down on the dry lake bed. Stanley wasn't sure, but he thought he could see the remains of Mary Lou off on the distance. You thirsty? Stanley said. No, Zero. Oh, said Zero. How about you? No, Stanley lied. He didn't want to be the first one to kind of a challenge between him and Zero. They climbed down into the frying pan. It was a different spot from where they had climbed up. They eased themselves down one ledge to another, and then let them slide in other places, especially careful with the stack. Stanley could no longer see the Mary Lou, but headed in the direction he thought was the right direction. As the sun rose, so did the familiar haze of heat and dirt. You thirsty? Zero asked. No, said Stanley. Because you have 3 full jars of water, said Zero. I thought it was getting too heavy for you. If you drink some, it will lighten your load. I'm not thirsty, said Stanley. But if you want a drink, I'll give you some. I'm not thirsty, said Zero. I was worried about you, Stanley smiled. I'm a camel, he said. They walked for what seemed like a very long time and still never came across the Mary Lou. Stanley was pretty sure they were heading in the right direction. He remembered when they had left the boat, they were headed towards the setting sun. Now they were headed towards the rising sun, which he knew the sun didn't rise and set in the east and west, but more of the southeast and southwest. But he wasn't sure how he would make a difference. His throat felt as if it was coated with sandpaper. You sure you're not thirsty? He asked. Not me, said Zero. His voice was dry and raspy. When they finally take a drink, they agreed to do it at the same time. Zero was now carrying the sack and sit down and took out 2 jars, giving one to Stanley. Decided to save the canteen for last. Since it couldn't be an accidentally break. You know I'm not thirsty, Stanley said as he unscrewed the lid. I'm just drinking, so you will. I'm just drinking, so you will, said Zero. They clanked the jars together and watched the other pour the water into their stubborn mouths. Zero was the first one to spot Mary Lou, maybe a quarter mile away, and just a little bit off to the right. They headed towards it. It wasn't even noon yet when they reached the boat. They sat against the shady side and rested. I don't know what happened to my mother, Zero said. She left and never came back. Stanley peeled an onion. She couldn't always take me with her. Sometimes she had to do things by herself. Stanley had the feeling Zero was explaining things to himself. She did tell me to wait in a certain place for her. When I was really little, I had to wait in small areas like a porch step or a doorway. Now I don't leave here until I get back, she says. I never liked it when she left. I had a stuffed animal, a little giraffe. I hugged it the whole time she was gone. When I got a bit bigger, I was allowed to stay in bigger areas like stay on this block or don't leave the park. But even then, I still held Jaffy. Stanley guessed that Jaffy was the name of Zero's giraffe. And then one day she didn't come back, Zero said. His voice sounded suddenly hollow. I waited for her at Laney Park. Laney Park, Stanley said Stanley. I've been there. You know the playscape? Asked Zero. Yeah, I played on it. I waited there for more than a month, Zero said. You know, the tunnel that you crawl through between the slide and the swinging bridge? That's where I slept. They ate 4 onions apiece and then drank about a half a jar of water. Stanley stood up and looked around. Everything looked the same in all directions. When I left camp, I was heading straight towards the Big Thumb. I saw the boat off to the right. So that means we have to turn a little to the left. So I was lost in thought. What? Okay, he said. They headed out. It was Stanley's turn to carry the sack. Some kid had the birthday party, Zero said. I guess it was about 2 weeks after my birth mother had left. There was a picnic table next to the playscape and balloons. They're tied to it. The kids looked at me as the same age as me. One girl said hi to me and asked if I wanted to play. I wanted to, but I didn't. I knew I didn't belong at the party, even though I wasn't their playscape. There was this one mother who kept staring at me like I was some kind of monster. Then later a boy asked me if I wanted a piece of cake. Then the same way, mother told me, go away. And she told the kids to stay away from me, so I never got the piece of cake. I ran away, so I forgot Jaffy. Did you ever find him? It was for a moment. Zero didn't answer. Then he said, he wasn't real. Stanley thought against his own parents, how awful it would be to never know if he was dead or alive. He realized that was Zero, how he must have felt, not knowing what happened to his own mother. He wondered why Zero had never mentioned it to his father. Hold on, Zero said, stopping abruptly. We're going the wrong way. No, this is right. You're heading towards the Big Thumb when you saw the boat off to your right. Maybe we should have turned left when we saw the boat. You sure? Zero drew a diagram onto the dirt. Stanley still wasn't sure. We need to go this way, first drawing a line into on the map and heading towards the way himself. Stanley followed. It didn't feel right to him, but Zero seemed sure. Sometimes in the middle of the afternoon, a cloud drifted across the sky and rocked the sun. It was welcome relief. Once again, Stanley felt that destiny was on his side. Zero stopped and held out his arm to stop Stanley too. Listen, Zero whispered. Stanley didn't hear anything. They continued walking very quietly as Stanley began to make out faint sounds of Camp Green Lake. They were still too far to see the camp, but they could hear a blended noise of mixed noises. As they got closer, he occasionally could hear Mr. Sir's distinctive bark. They walked slowly and quietly, aware that sounds travel in both directions. They approached a cluster of holes. Let's wait here until they go in. Stanley nodded. He checked to make sure nothing was living in it, then climbed down into a hole. Zero climbed into the one next to him. Despite having gone a wrong way for a while, it hadn't taken them nearly as long as Stanley had expected. Now they just had to wait. The sun cut through the cloud, and Stanley felt its rays speeding down on him. But soon more clouds filled the sky, shading Stanley in his hole. He waited until he was certain that the last of the campers finished up for the day. Then he waited a little bit longer. It was possible he and Zero climbed out of their holes and crept towards camp. Stanley held the sack in front of him, crawled in his arms instead of his shoulder to keep the jars from clanking each other. A wave of terror rushed over him when he saw the compound, the tents, the rec room, and the warden's cabinet under 2 oak trees. That fear made him dizzy. He took a breath, summoned his courage, and continued. That's the one, he whispered, pointing out to the hole where he found the golden tube. It was about 50 yards away, but he was pretty sure it was the right hole. There was no need to risk going any closer. They climbed down into adjacent holes and waited for the camp to fall asleep. Chapter 44. This is the end of this video. Bye!